I have spent the last few years traveling the world and writing about my favorite elixir, whiskey. This show is all about the brands, the spirits, and the distilleries you know and love. Join us as we share our stories and our words of whiskey. And welcome back to today's episode of Words of Whiskey. I am Josh Hart. So I wrote for the Dallas Morning News, whiskey, scotch, and bourbon reviews, Guide Live, all those things. And what I loved most about that was my time to get down and talk to other reviewers, people who are as passionate as I was about the spirit and the different expressions from bourbon to scotch to whiskey, whether it was Irish or American or Japanese, whatever it was. And so I love doing this show where I'm talking to other people who are just as passionate about me. And today we're going to be traveling to LA to meet with Reid Mitenbuler, who is also an author as well as a whiskey reviewer. Reid, how's it going today?
It's going great.
Perfect. So we have chosen to sip on some Elijah, the Elijah 12, which has lost its age. You can't buy it. Well, you probably can still find some bottles, but they're not putting any more of that out. Is that correct?
Right. The bottle I have still has the age statement on it.
So yeah. So mine just says small batch, but hey, it's fine. It's essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
So we're doing social distance bourbon tasting together. What was it about Elijah Craig that you like the most?
This is a classic bourbon. It comes from Heaven Hill, and I don't know if I'd call it a fastball straight down the middle because it's just a big vanilla bomb. But this is kind of a winter whiskey for me just because it's so warm. There's a lot of wood on it. And that vanilla, it kind of just makes you think of cold weather, snow.
So
although
I have
in LA, we don't get that.
So you just crank the AC up and then sit back and then sip on some whiskey.
I put one of those like fire log things on the TV.
Yeah. I remember. So my first time sampling was probably about 13 years ago. I was 21, maybe. And I was a Bud Light, Smirnoff vodka guy at that point in time in my life. I hadn't quite grown up, and so I was at a liquor store looking for a good whiskey to try. And I had done Jack and I had done Jim, and those were okay, and Coke. And but I said I want a good sipping whiskey. And the guy behind the counter knew what he was talking about, just didn't know his audience. And he handed me, the Elijah Craig. I want to say it was one of those like full-on like cast strength. It wasn't the cast strength they have, but it was a full-on experience. I remember went home and just tasting barrel for the first time, and I wasn't used to it. And it was at the time it was a chore to get through. I would have loved it now, but it was a lot of barrel. And that goes back into now learning more about them and going out to Kentucky and and getting a better view of what they do. That's what they're about. They're the first group to char their barrels, and the first to char, and they love bringing out those flavors in your batch. Anything else that you can think of about Elijah Craig that what other things when you've read about them have you really picked up on that you've loved?
Well, yeah, definitely Heaven Hill's known for, going pretty heavy on barrel. I remember the first time I actually had it, if I remember correctly, was my first trip to bourbon country, and it was around 2004, 2005. And, so before the bourbon boom really was at full gale, and I was in the tasting room, when you're at the Heritage Center that they've set up. And it was just one of the things that they were pouring on the tour for free was the Elijah Craig 18. Because it was before the big, so it was just like have full glass, just kind of.
Yeah.
They had heavier hands back then, and it was like everyone, they were real generous. And I remember I was there with my dad and one of my best friends, and they were just like, well, here you go. And it was just the 18, and they were just, glugging it out in glasses, and, just, it was when you could buy it for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So kind of a special experience that way, because back then you you thought of the value as a little bit different because none of this stuff was rare. It was all easy to find.
Yeah.
So, and that one now has kind of become real hard to find. The
Hard to
18.
find. Yeah, but that's what I love about the older like distilleries is they easily could say, hey, we're gonna be $60-$70 a bottle, and you'll love us, and you'll buy it. But they still always offer. Because I think a lot of small batch stuff, or even the 12, you can still get it for a reasonable price, depending on where you go, anywhere $35-$40. That's a reasonable price because you're not supposed to, drink large amounts at a time. It's meant for sipping on and having, an ounce or two a day, or a couple ounces a day, depending on how you want to do it. But it could easily be your everyday bourbon. I think that's what I like about it a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And that price thing too, I think I've talked to some of the companies about it where it's like, you've got this product that you had to sell at a certain price point way back in the day when no one was really going to pay more than that price point for it.
Yeah.
Fast forward, bourbon gets really popular. And you've got this thing that you established in the market a certain way. You established it at this point. Whiskey of that age could probably go for a lot more if you were to release it under a new label. And they're all very aware of that, which is part of the reason I think you're seeing some of the age statements drop.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, but if we do that, I mean, a big customer base is going to get really upset. So you're kind of stuck in this pocket, right, where you have to kind of keep it going. So those are some of the best deals in the market, I think, too, the old legacy brands.
I don't think they're hurting for money. So, I mean, I think that's one of those deals. They know they can make more, but they can make quality spirit and keep an audience happy for a long period of time. And that they have it down. They're not one of these fly by nights. And I remember like the saddest experience I've had so far as being a person who reviews is learning of the process of buying distilled spirit and then adding flavoring to it and adding color to it, and then putting it in over a wood like lay, so it kind of goes into a barrel that way, so it touches wood, therefore it can be called whiskey, and bottling it up and selling it. And I think realizing that, I put a lot more value on people who choose to do it the old way, the hard way, where I'm going to sit here and it's going to have to sit for at least 4 years. And it's going to have to, at that point in time, the longer it sits, the better it is, and we're going to kind of see what happens. But they actually do it, I say, the right way to get things done. So I always respect bourbon for that, because you know what you're getting, unlike when you buy a bottle of whiskey. It's sometimes hit or miss.
Mm-hmm. I think too, like, there's something about, for me, especially American whiskey, especially because when I got into it, it was always a good deal, and it was seen as kind of humble. And that's part of the appeal is, at its core, it's pretty simple. I mean, you're dealing with pretty simple ingredients. You just got some grains, primarily corn. There's nothing fancy or particularly rarefied about the grains. And then the barrels, it's oak.
Yeah.
And you just kind of cook this stuff, you make it, you throw it in a barrel. So, when we get to this, when you have this idea of these really rarefied whiskeys that people are shelling a lot of money for, these special unicorns that people are hoarding, there's something that, to me, kind of runs against the spirit of the whiskey. It's kind of a democratic thing. It's got this wide appeal. Really at its peak. For me, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of older bourbons. So when you get into that special window of bottled in bond up to 10 years, and it's something, it's like that's the sweet spot. So it's nice to me that sweet spot isn't anything that you have to go too crazy, like out into the extreme to make. So it's accessible to anyone.
Yeah. And the thing that's important about the age statement being taken off is that's a trend we're seeing with a lot of whiskeys, both Scotch and bourbons. They're starting to take age statements off. One, it gives them more flexibility. They're going off of more of what the taste profile should be. And they can, as long as they can achieve that taste profile, they're going to keep it in the same bottle. Whereas if you're unfamiliar, which I can't imagine watching this show for this long and not being familiar, if you're unfamiliar, the age statement on the bottle is the youngest barrel that they have in that bottle. So if there's a 12, you could theoretically have 25-year-old bourbon in there. You could have 18-year-old bourbon in there. You could have 15, but as long as there's a little bit of 12, they have to put 12 on the label. So there's not just 12-year-old bourbon in a barrel called 12. It's just that's the youngest age. So the reason why people like taking ages off and just putting a name to it. You'll see it in Scotland where they'll add colors even. Where they'll say, hey, this is, this spirit gold or yellow or whatever, amber. They're just putting colors to it because this is what we want the flavor to taste like. So as long as we can match that, then great. It doesn't have to have an age on it. We don't have to put any 12. If we can get to that same taste profile. That was, again, one of those things that you kind of learn, I'm sure, as you have, Reid, on those tours, where you can get a barrel that's been sitting for 15 years and a barrel that's been sitting for 8 years, or two 15-year-olds, and they taste totally different. And so being able to go by and just grab barrels and go, hey, I don't care how old it is, this one's ready to go, this one's not, this one's ready to go, this one's not, it doesn't affect your age statement. So it's cool to see that growing in popularity. I know for a lot of people, and me included, when I was young, I thought the older it is, the better it is. If it said 21, then by God, it's going to be delicious. And I've had 21-year-old, Scotch that was not my favorite, and I've had 10-year-old Scotch that was delicious. So it's not about the age; it's about what's in the bottle. So that's been great. Yeah.
Brooklady does a good job of that, especially for a Scotch. What's funny, because the companies sort of marketed themselves into that problem a little bit in the 50s, where they had huge surpluses, and they had, Shenley, which has now been absorbed. A lot of the parts of Shenley have been absorbed into Diageo, Lewis Rosensteel's company. They had something like 8 times the demand, like the supply that they would need for a full year. So they had basically 8 years worth of whiskey that they had made. Huge lake of bourbon. And they could see where the market was going. It was being upscaled. And they had all this really old stuff. They were going to be competing internationally with Scotch, which had these really old age statements. And they were looking to tap into the luxury market with a relatively simple product. So that's when they really started putting a lot of money into age statements. I was always struck when doing research for my book, how in the 30s you'd see age statements all over these bottles, 3 years, 4 years. And companies would boast about that. Like, it was just, they were very transparent. It was really cool. But then in the 50s, it was like, we're just going to really lean into the older age stuff. And all the advertisements were, do you have enough age for your money? It tastes better because it's older, like all this kind of stuff. Just because they needed to sell it. They needed to sell it however they could.
Yeah.
And that's how it was for years, until just recently when the demand shifted. You've got more people wanting it. So now they can they're kind of trying to educate consumers back down the scale a little bit, where it's like, the age is. And I remember having companies tell me in the 80s, when they still had huge surpluses and the Japanese market was really hot for American whiskey, way hotter than the US market. Companies were telling me, we had some stuff that was truly awful, just really old. It tasted like a pencil. It was just way over wood. But because the Japanese market tended to take its cues from Scotch with those older age statements, because we were selling some real crap to the Japanese market for top dollar. Because stuff we should have maybe even just redistilled or just dumped.
50-year-old Scotch. Don't worry. Here you go. Yeah.
And he was like, I won't say what company. He was like, we sold some crap to that market just because they thought, oh, well, it's older.
Yeah, it's older. Yeah, and that was something that was like, as you do these and you go on these tastings and you talk to people and you learn, you realize, at the end of the day, the number on the bottle doesn't matter. It's all about the flavor profile, and the distiller taking time and doing it right. And I think Elijah Craig's a great example of that. They take the time, they do it right. They've been doing it for 230 years, 220 plus years, whatever it is.
Since the 30s.
Yeah. Oh, that's 30.
When the company started.
I thought they were like 200 years old. I was reading back in the day that they were like they've been brewing since like back in the day for like 200 years. Am I way off on that?
Heaven Hill started right after repeal.
Really?
Family.
Well,
Elijah Craig as a figure is that old, but
is that old?
Well, that's the other kind of that's one of the most fun parts of whiskey is we've got to create these stories, and creating a story that taps back into that more ancient heritage.
Yeah,
there's such an appeal to that. So you see all these brands that are relatively new. Heaven Hill's one of the older companies actually today.
Yeah,
but you've got to create that mystique, and a good way to do that is find a historical figure and.
Well, weren't they? I guess maybe that's what they're tapping into, because weren't they one of the ones that were allowed to distill even during Prohibition, with doing it for medical reasons?
No, the Shapiras were haberdashers in Louisville, clothing, and they could see that when prohibition's going to be lifted, it was like there's going to be a market here. So they
Yeah.
got the investment, and then they started new. And then one of their first distillers was a member of the Beam family. So they had Beams Distilling, which they still do actually.
Yeah.
Parker, you know the Parker's Heritage. It's
Yeah.
Parker Beam, who has since passed, and Craig Beam. So it's kind of a cool alliance between those two families that way.
Maybe that's what they're tapping into because of the Beam tradition goes back.
Yeah, well, it's Kentucky, right? So there's just all these
yeah.
What's the old joke about Kentucky where you've got 12 last names if you go back far enough? Like all these families that kind of have been there forever.
Blended families, yeah. Well, Reid, I appreciate that. Now, tell me, I know you have Wild Minds that comes out in December, which you can get on Amazon now. But you said you're writing another book about whiskey. Well, what book was that?
No, my first book is Bourbon Empire, which came out in 2015. It's a history of the American whiskey industry, a history of bourbon. It was Viking Penguin published it, and it's out. I mean, it's sold wherever you buy books. It's online. It's on Amazon.
Well, that's
Wild
exciting.
Minds is actually my next book, yeah.
Well, we'll have a link to both of those in the profile down below in the description. Reid, it was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and taking time and sharing a glass of phenomenal Elijah Craig.
Same here. Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
No problem.